The deal includes the meters on the street. And how does meter enforcement work? In the first instance, HPP is named as an agent for meter enforcement during the lease term. That is not a delegation of the police power of the city. It is an agency relationship approved by the court systems, and we'd be happy to provide you, I know there's been some questions about this, with the decisions of the courts in Pennsylvania regarding this, as well as the various statutes relating to it. The city still has to make the rules for meters. It sets the fine amounts, it establishes booting and towing rules, and it decides whether a street gets meters or doesn't get meters. It's our job then to administer and enforce those decisions. We do have the right to ask the city to make certain adjustments at our request, and after deliberation, the city may elect to or not. HPP has to administer those rules and is entitled to the associated revenues. To the extent that within the terms of the contract, we've made a request that we would be entitled to and it's not granted, it could potentially, but not necessarily, constitute a compensation event.
Hey, this is James Roxbury, June 6, 2008, and the clip that you just watched was Jacob Frydman, principal in the firm HPP, as he explains to City Council some of the details in a proposed contract between the Harrisburg Parking System and HPP. And we felt that this section is probably the most important part of the entire contract, the enforcement of parking meters. Jacob goes on to say, and this is the press package given out, he goes on to say, and it's titled Meter Enforcement, page 20, that the city, through City Council, still has controls over HPP. The city still makes rules for the meters, the city sets fines amounts, the city establishes booting and towing rules, and the city decides whether a street has meters. He also goes on to say that HPP does have the right to make certain adjustments at our request. And the adjustments could be if HPP came in the day after the contract is signed and said we want to install 3,000 parking meters in the uptown, midtown section of Harrisburg. Well, City Council might not be happy with that, and maybe City Council might vote it down, because Jacob says they have the right to here, and he's truthful about this. They have the right to vote it down. But let's look into the actual contract. And this is the contract, section 3.20, and labeled parking enforcement. And it goes on to say in subchapter A, paragraph A, appointee as agent. The authority hereby irrevocably appoints and designates and authorizes the concessionaire during the term of this agreement, and the city hereby agrees and acknowledges such appointee designation and authorization to perform all enforcement actions. So it's right here in the paragraph. It further goes on to say, the city and the authority acknowledge and agree that the concessionaire shall be entitled to tow, boot, or undertake other enforcement actions against parking violators and retain all money collected as a result of towing and booting or otherwise. Okay, so it's stated in the contract that this is the right of HPP. Jacob's speaking about it here. He's speaking about the rights of counsel. But he further goes on to say, and we do have the right to make certain adjustments at our request. The request to increase fines, or the request to discontinue permit parking, the request to install 2,000 parking meters. Jacob goes on to state, in the contract we made a request, and if it's not granted, and that's what he's saying, if HPP comes to City Council and requests an additional 2,000 parking meters, City Council says it's a bad idea, Jacob then says, the request is not granted. It could potentially, but not necessarily, constitute a compensation event. Okay, those are the magic words. He states first that city has the right to vote down their request. He states that he has a right to make the request. But he goes on in that if the request is not granted, it could potentially, but not necessarily, constitute a compensation event. So we'd better look into what compensation events mean. So we have the section here of compensation events. It's section 5.5 under compensation events, and it is paragraph F, on-street parking enforcement. In the event that the city does not increase the fines, fees, and penalties due and payable for any violations of on-street parking regulations as reasonable requested from time to time by the concessionaire, or in the event that any law shall be enacted or enforced by the city limiting the amounts of any fines, fees, and penalties due and payable for any violations of on-street parking regulations, the same shall constitute a compensation event. So now the compensation event is on the table. If HPP goes to council, makes a request, city council denies that request, HPP defines it as a compensation event, HPP files an action in Dauphin County Court demanding to be compensated the difference of what their request was. In the case of 2,000 parking meters, they would go in and ask the courts for the city to provide them with the income from the additional 2,000 parking meters. If they decided to raise the levy of a parking ticket to $100 the day after the contract is signed, and the HPP considers that reasonable, and the city says, no, we're not going to grant you that, it states in that paragraph that is the right of HPP to declare that a compensation event and go to court to remedy the difference between what the parking fine would be and what it is now. So if it was $14, it was raised to $100, city council said no, HPP could sue for that $86 increase in the fine. And they would get it because it's in the contract. Now, I'm not an attorney, but an attorney who is working for the Royal Bank of Canada on behalf of Harrisburg Parking Authority is Andrew Georgione. So let's go to Andrew Georgione at the Parking Authority meeting where Andrew is a representative of Royal Bank of Canada working as the financing branch of HPA, the Harrisburg Parking Authority. So in essence, this council is working on the team hired by the Parking Authority. Let's watch what Andrew Georgione defines as a compensation event. And he also goes on to define what the remedies could be. And we'll take a look at Andrew.
Parking enforcement, let me jump ahead to page 47. Under this agreement, the authority is going to appoint the concessionaire as the entity to do all parking enforcement at all the parking meters. And they will levy all fines, and the concessionaire, HPP, will set all those fines in cooperation with the authority and the city. For that right, HPP is paying an additional $210,000 a year. So that's in addition to the $125,000. Section 5.5 on page 52 talks about compensation events. These are events that if the authority is required to do certain actions under this agreement or breaches the agreement, that it must, and jointly and severally with the city, compensate the concessionaire. That is setting of rates. Rate setting responsibility is still yours going forward, the parking authorities, although it must be done at the direction of HPP. So if you fail to set a certain rate that they request, that's a compensation event. If you increase taxes, if you provide for additional shuttle service or do not keep that price delta on City Island, if you do not set certain enforcement rates for on-street parking, these are all events where they become compensation events to HPP. A determination will be made what the damages would be to HPP for your failure to act or for certain actions that you take, and you would have to make a payment to HPP. Parking fee revenues were in Article 7 on page 56. Again, HPP is given the right to set rates. The rates that they request are then brought to this board for approval. They cannot do that more. They cannot increase rates more than twice in any 12-month period, and cannot increase them more than 100%.